Mechanic quit after 30 years. 2 weeks later, his boss pulled up in a luxury car. Dismissed. A highly talented black engineer shown the door. Then, a mere 2 weeks later, his boss was begging him to come back. What happened? What did he do that could cause such a dramatic shift, turning the entire company upside down? The sound of a ratchet clicking into place echoed through the busy garage of Caldwell Automotive, the shop Malcolm Carter had called home for over 30 years. The smell of motor oil, hot metal, and grease filled the air. The kind of scent that most people found overwhelming, but to Malcolm, it was as familiar as the breath in his lungs. Under the hood of a 1967 Ford Mustang, Malcolm worked with precision, his calloused hands moving with the ease of decades of experience. He didn't need a manual or a diagnostic tool. He could hear when an engine was off, feel when something wasn't right. And that's why customers trusted him. Not the shop. Not the name on the building. Him. For years, people had brought their classic cars, family minivans, and prized possessions to this shop, not because of its fancy signage or quick turnaround promises, but because they knew Malcolm Carter would get it right the first time. But today the shop felt different. Colder, quieter, as if it knew something Malcolm didn't. He had just finished tightening the last bolt when he heard his name. "Malcolm, we need to talk." The voice was sharp, businesslike. Malcolm wiped his hands on a grease-stained rag before turning toward Ethan Caldwell, the new owner of the shop. Ethan stood near the entrance to the office, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning numbers rather than looking Malcolm in the face. Malcolm already knew where this conversation was headed. He sighed, folding his arms. "What's on your mind, boss?" Ethan finally looked up, but his expression lacked warmth, lacked familiarity. "I've been looking over the numbers," Ethan said, tapping his clipboard. "Your repair times are slower than the younger guys. We need efficiency, not nostalgia." There it was. The thing Malcolm had dreaded ever since James Caldwell, Ethan's father, retired and left the shop to his son. Malcolm stood there, letting the words settle, even though he already knew how this was going to end. "You're saying I'm too slow," Malcolm said evenly. "I'm saying," Ethan corrected, "that we need to move forward. That means making tough decisions." Malcolm took a slow breath. 30 years. 30 years of building trust, loyalty, and reputation, reduced to a set of numbers on a clipboard. He could have argued, could have pointed out that he had trained half the mechanics here, taught them everything they knew. But he didn't, because he knew there was no point. So instead, Malcolm did what he had always done when a job wasn't worth fixing. He nodded once, wiped the last of the grease from his hands, and turned to pack up his tools. Gathering his things was harder than he expected. Each sticker on his toolbox, each photo of an old repair job, each note left by a customer over the years, told a story. He had built this shop alongside James Caldwell, starting as a kid sweeping floors, working his way up one wrench turn at a time. James had treated him like family. Ethan? Ethan had just thrown him away like a spare part that didn't fit anymore. As Malcolm carried his last box to his truck, the shop fell eerily silent. The younger mechanics stood by, lowering their heads, some of them shifting uncomfortably. They wanted to say something, but they needed their paychecks more than they needed to speak up. The customers were already hearing the news. Some had gathered near the lot, their faces a mix of confusion and anger. Jerome J. Reynolds, a senior mechanic who had worked alongside Malcolm for years, finally broke the silence. "This is wrong, man," Jerome muttered, shaking his head. Malcolm offered a small nod. "I know." And with that, he closed the door to his truck, turned the key, and pulled out of the parking lot for the last time. He didn't look back. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in just 2 weeks, Caldwell Automotive would be on the verge of collapse. And Ethan Caldwell? He'd be the one knocking on Malcolm's door, begging him to come back. 2 weeks later, Caldwell Automotive was falling apart. Ethan Caldwell had walked into his father's shop with a plan. He had seen efficiency as the future. believed that cutting repair times by 30% meant higher profits. He thought Malcolm Carter was just an outdated mechanic, someone he could replace. He was wrong. The day after Malcolm left, Ethan wasted no time implementing changes. Digital timers were installed in every repair bay, tracking how long each mechanic spent on a job. Quotas were introduced: 5 repairs per day, minimum. Quality control, optional. If there's extra time, Ethan had told the mechanics, then double-check the work. But don't waste time being a perfectionist. Repairs were rushed. The younger mechanics, who had once learned from Malcolm's careful eye, were now pushed to move faster. At first, things seemed to be working. The shop was busier than ever. But then, the first signs of trouble began to show. On day 3, a Dodge Charger was towed back to the shop. Its brakes had failed on the highway. The mechanic who worked on it, a 19-year-old fresh out of trade school, had rushed the repair to meet his quota. The customer was furious, storming into the shop, his face red with anger. "You people nearly got me killed," he shouted, slamming his keys onto the front desk. Ethan smoothed things over with a free repair, dismissing it as a one-time mistake. But then, by the end of the first week, the calls started rolling in. A Honda Accord returned twice in 3 days for the same transmission problem. A BMW that had been serviced on Monday was back on Friday with a new engine issue that hadn't existed before. A fleet customer, one of their biggest accounts, called to cancel after multiple breakdowns on company vehicles. The front desk phone rang non-stop, filled with complaints, refund requests, and threats to take business elsewhere. The receptionist, who had been working at Caldwell Automotive since the days of James Caldwell, couldn't even look Ethan in the eye anymore. "We've never had this many issues before," she muttered under her breath. Ethan tried to ignore it, convincing himself that this was just a rough patch. But deep down, he knew the truth. This was Malcolm's absence. Malcolm had seen the small details before they became big problems. He could hear a timing belt slightly off before it became a full replacement. He knew when a seal was loose before it caused an oil leak. He trained his mechanics to do the same. Without him, the shop was breaking down one mistake at a time. The young mechanics were exhausted. They had once loved working here, but now they were rushed, stressed, and overwhelmed. They barely had time to check their own work, let alone learn anything new. And then it happened. Jerome J. Reynolds, the senior mechanic, Malcolm's right-hand man, finally had enough. It was closing time when Jerome stormed into Ethan's office, a stack of work orders in his hands. "This ain't working," he said, slamming the papers onto the desk. Ethan barely looked up from his computer. "We're just adjusting. It'll smooth out." "No, it won't," Jerome shot back. "We're rushing jobs, sending cars out that ain't road ready. This isn't a shop anymore, it's a damn assembly line." Ethan leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "We're making more money." "For now," Jerome snapped. "But customers ain't stupid. They know when they're getting bad work. We lost 3 fleet accounts this week, Ethan. How long before the rest follow?" Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples, frustrated. "People will get used to the new system. We'll just fix things when they come back." Jerome laughed dryly, shaking his head. "That's the difference between you and Malcolm," he said. "He never let him come back." The words hit Ethan harder than he wanted to admit. But before he could respond, Jerome tore off his work shirt, threw it onto the chair, and walked to the door. Ethan sat up straight, stunned. "You can't be serious." Jerome turned, smirking. "I am, but don't worry. I think you're about to learn just how much damage you've done." And with that, he walked out. The next morning, Ethan walked into the shop to find 2 more resignation letters on his desk. By the end of the day, a 3rd mechanic quit on the spot. Then, an email hit his inbox from the auto rental company that had been using Caldwell Automotive for fleet maintenance for over a decade. Effective immediately, all future repairs will be outsourced elsewhere. Ethan felt his stomach drop. He stood from his desk and looked out at the shop floor. Where there had once been a full team of mechanics, there were now only a handful left, struggling to keep up with the growing backlog of work. The air was thick with tension. Customers were calling non-stop, demanding explanations for shoddy repairs. Ethan swallowed hard, realizing the shop was crumbling in front of him. That night, he sat alone in his father's old office, staring at the framed photos on the wall. A picture of James Caldwell shaking hands with customers. A photo of Malcolm and James standing beside a restored 1969 Camaro. A grand opening picture from decades ago, back when Caldwell Automotive meant something. He had destroyed everything his father built. And there was only one person who could fix it. Ethan reached for his phone, his pride screaming at him not to do it. But he had no other choice. He pulled up Malcolm's number and hit dial. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. Voicemail. Ethan exhaled sharply, dropping the phone onto his desk. If Malcolm wouldn't answer a call, he'd have to ask him in person. Ethan Caldwell stared at his phone, the call to Malcolm Carter still unanswered. He had known Malcolm wouldn't pick up, but that didn't make the rejection sting any less. This was the man Ethan had thrown away, and now he needed him more than ever. Because Caldwell Automotive was collapsing. By the end of the second week without Malcolm, the shop was barely holding together. The front desk was overwhelmed, angry customers lined up, demanding refunds, repairs, or both. Mechanics were stretched too thin, struggling to fix backlogged work and repeated mistakes. The shop's reputation, once untouchable, was now in freefall. But the worst was yet to come. The phone rang. The receptionist hesitated before answering, already dreading what was on the other end. "Caldwell Automotive," she said. A furious voice exploded through the receiver. "This is Henry Lawson. Your shop serviced my son's car last week, a 2018 Jeep Grand Cherokee. Brakes were changed, fluids topped off. You remember that?" She flipped through the records, her stomach sinking as she recognized the name. "Yes, sir. Is there a problem?" Henry's voice turned ice cold. "My son is in the hospital." The entire shop floor went still. Ethan, who had just stepped out of his office, froze in place. Henry continued, his voice shaking with anger. "The brakes failed while he was driving on the freeway. He barely survived. The doctors say he's lucky to be alive." The receptionist felt sick. "Sir, I am so sorry." "I don't want an apology," Henry snapped. "I want answers. I want to know who signed off on those repairs. And if I don't get those answers, you'll be hearing from my lawyer." Then he hung up. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He turned to the lead mechanic still left on staff, his voice tense. "Who worked on that Jeep?" The mechanic flipped through work orders, scanning reports frantically. Finally, his face drained of color. It was Jamal. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, knowing exactly what had happened. Jamal was one of the younger mechanics, one of the guys Ethan had pushed to work faster, hit quotas, and ignore minor details. He had cut corners. And now, a kid was in the hospital because of it. The lawsuit arrives. A legal notice was served the next morning. News spreads. By the end of the day, the local newspaper ran a story about Caldwell Automotive's negligence. Customers walk away. Anyone still bringing their cars in canceled their appointments. The shop had gone from struggling to dying. Ethan stood in the middle of his father's shop, surrounded by half-empty repair bays and a skeleton crew of mechanics who hadn't quit yet. He felt every single mistake he had made pressing down on him. Then the final blow came. The front desk manager walked into his office, placing a thick envelope on his desk. "What's this?" Ethan asked. She removed her name tag and placed it on top of the envelope. "My resignation," she said. Ethan's stomach twisted. "You can't quit," he said. "Not now." She met his gaze without flinching. "I worked for your father for 20 years, she said, "and I saw what this place used to be, what it stood for." She shook her head. "This isn't it." Then she turned and walked out. For the first time, Ethan finally understood. He had destroyed his father's legacy. And there was only one man who could fix it. That night, Ethan got into his car and drove across town. His destination? Elite Auto. The competition. The place where Malcolm Carter now worked. As Ethan pulled into the lot, he saw Malcolm leaning over the hood of a '69 Camaro, adjusting the engine with steady hands. Around him, his new crew worked in sync, a stark contrast to the chaos at Caldwell Automotive. Ethan sat in his car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped out and walked toward Malcolm. Malcolm didn't even look up at first. He just kept working. But one of the younger mechanics noticed Ethan standing awkwardly at the edge of the shop and nudged Malcolm. "Boss," the kid muttered, "you've got company." Malcolm wiped his hands on a grease-stained rag, finally turning. His eyes met Ethan's, and for a moment he didn't say a word. Then he simply nodded. "Ethan." Ethan swallowed hard. Malcolm. The weight of everything that had happened hung between them. The firing, the failures, the lawsuit, the collapse of Caldwell Automotive. Finally, Ethan exhaled. "I need to talk." Malcolm leaned against the workbench, crossing his arms. "I figured." A long silence stretched between them. Then, with a sigh, Malcolm motioned to the side of the shop. "Come on," he said. Ethan followed him. And for the first time in his life, he was the one asking for help. Malcolm Carter leaned against the workbench, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Ethan Caldwell stood in front of him, shifting uncomfortably. The roles had reversed. A year ago, Ethan had been the one holding power. Now, he was the one asking for help. Silence hung between them, broken only by the distant hum of engines and the clinking of tools in the background. Finally, Malcolm spoke. "You're a long way from your office, Ethan." Ethan exhaled slowly. Malcolm wiped his hands on a grease-stained rag, "And I'm guessing this isn't just a social visit." Ethan shook his head. "The shop is falling apart." Malcolm smirked slightly, but there was no humor in it. "I know." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Of course you do." Word gets around. Malcolm tossed the rag onto the bench. "People talk." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. "Look, I screwed up. I thought I could run things differently. I thought I could make it better." He sighed. "But I was wrong." Malcolm didn't react. He just studied Ethan, waiting. Ethan swallowed hard. "I need you to come back." For the first time, Malcolm let out a short chuckle. "You mean the same way you needed me gone?" Ethan closed his eyes briefly, inhaling deeply before looking Malcolm in the eye. "I made a mistake." Malcolm tilted his head slightly, watching him. "Which part?" Ethan hesitated. "All of it." That was the first honest thing he had said all night. Malcolm exhaled, shaking his head. "It wasn't just about me, Ethan. It was about the shop, about the mechanics, about the people who trusted us with their cars and their safety. You turned it into a numbers game, a business model." Ethan didn't argue. He had nothing left to fight with. "I know," he admitted. "And now it's a disaster. The customers left. The mechanics quit. We're losing money. And now—" He hesitated, then forced himself to say it. "We're getting sued." That made Malcolm pause. "Sued?" Ethan nodded grimly. "Faulty brake job. A kid ended up in the hospital." Malcolm let out a slow breath, his jaw tightening. Damn. For the first time, the weight of it all seemed to hit him too. Because no matter how badly Ethan had handled things, Malcolm still cared about the shop. And the idea that someone had been hurt because Caldwell Automotive had failed them? That didn't sit right with him. After a long silence, Ethan reached into his jacket and pulled out a folder, setting it on the bench between them. "What's this?" Malcolm asked. Ethan took a deep breath. "An offer." Malcolm picked up the folder, flipping through the pages. Inside was a contract, but not just for a job, for full operational control of Caldwell Automotive. Hiring, training, repair standards, quality assurance. Everything Malcolm had fought for. Everything Ethan had dismissed. "I'm giving you the shop," Ethan said simply. "You run it, your way, no interference from me." Malcolm's brows lifted slightly, but he said nothing. Ethan swallowed. I know I can't fix what I did, I know I burned bridges, but you can fix it, Malcolm. If anyone can, it's you. Malcolm flipped the contract closed, tapping it against the workbench as he studied Ethan. You really think you can just hand me a contract and I'll come running back? Ethan hesitated. No, he exhaled. But I'm hoping you'll at least think about it. Malcolm stared at him for a long moment, then slowly nodded. I'll think about it. Ethan let out a quiet breath of relief. That's all I can ask? Malcolm glanced down at the contract in his hands, his fingers tightening around the edges. There was a time when this shop had meant everything to him. And despite everything, a part of him still cared. Maybe too much. 2 days passed before Malcolm Carter made his decision. For the first time in over a year, he drove back toward Caldwell Automotive, the place where he had spent 3 decades of his life. As he pulled into the parking lot, the sight of the shop nearly made him turn around. It looked nothing like the place he had left. The lot was half empty, where it used to be packed with customers. The garage doors were wide open, but only a few mechanics were inside. The front desk looked chaotic, papers piled up, the phone ringing constantly. Malcolm exhaled, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He could have stayed at Elite Auto. He was happy there, respected, valued. But this place? This was home. With a sigh, Malcolm turned off the engine, grabbed his toolbox, and stepped out of the truck. As soon as he entered the garage, the remaining mechanics froze, their heads turning in his direction. One of them, a young kid named Devin, nearly dropped the wrench in his hand. Yo, is that? The front desk manager peeked around the corner, her eyes widening. Malcolm? Even Ethan, standing near his office door, stopped mid-conversation, his posture stiffening as he locked eyes with Malcolm. Malcolm let his gaze sweep over the shop, taking in the unfinished work, the exhaustion on the mechanics' faces, the unease in the air. It wasn't just failing, it was on the verge of shutting down for good. Finally, he turned to Ethan. Where's my office? Ethan let out a quiet breath, nodded once, and motioned toward the back. Malcolm stepped into his old office, setting his toolbox down on the desk. Ethan followed him in, closing the door behind them. So, Ethan started, does this mean? I have conditions, Malcolm cut in. Ethan nodded quickly, name them. Malcolm sat back in the chair, the same chair he had once occupied before Ethan threw him out. First, Malcolm said, I'm rehiring Jerome and anyone else who left because of your decisions. Ethan swallowed. Done. Second, Malcolm continued, we bring back full quality control. No more cutting corners, no more rushed repairs. We fix cars right, or we don't fix them at all. Ethan hesitated slightly but then nodded. All right. Malcolm leaned forward. And last, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument, you don't question me when it comes to the shop floor. If I'm coming back, I'm running things my way. Ethan held his gaze for a long moment, then exhaled and nodded. Okay. Malcolm studied him for another beat, looking for hesitation, for ego. But he didn't see it. Just exhaustion. A man who had finally learned that pride wouldn't fix a broken shop. Malcolm stood up, extended his hand. Ethan grasped it firmly. Welcome back, Ethan said. Malcolm smirked. Let's get to work. The next morning, Caldwell Automotive felt different. For the first time in a year, Malcolm Carter was back in charge. His first order of business, fixing the mess Ethan had made. By noon, familiar faces started returning. Jerome J. Reynolds was the first. When he walked into the shop, wiping his hands on a rag, he let out a low whistle. Well, well, he said, grinning as he leaned against the workbench. Didn't think I'd see the day. Malcolm smirked. Took you long enough. Jerome chuckled, shaking Malcolm's hand. Heard you were back. Figured if you're crazy enough to return, I might as well too. By the end of the day, 3 more former mechanics showed up, ready to work. And with them, customers who had once sworn they'd never come back. Malcolm didn't waste time. He walked the floor, checking on every repair, retraining the younger mechanics who had never learned the right way to do things. No more 5 repair quotas. No more rushed inspections. No more fix it when it breaks again nonsense. Every car that left Caldwell Automotive would now meet the same standard it had under James Caldwell's leadership. And slowly word spread. By the end of the first week, the phones were ringing, not with complaints, but with old customers asking if Malcolm was really back. And when they got the answer, they started booking appointments again. One evening, long after closing, Ethan stepped onto the shop floor. Malcolm was under the hood of a 1970 Dodge Challenger, carefully adjusting a timing chain. Ethan watched him work for a moment, then cleared his throat. Malcolm glanced up. "What?" Ethan sighed. "The books are looking better." Malcolm didn't respond. He just kept working. Ethan hesitated, then leaned against the tool chest. "I get it now," he admitted. "Why my dad trusted you so much." Malcolm finally put down his wrench, studying Ethan for a moment. "You thought running this place was about numbers," Malcolm said, "but you were wrong." Ethan nodded slowly. "Yeah, I see that now." Malcolm smirked. "Good, then stop talking and hand me that socket wrench." Ethan chuckled, grabbing the tool from the cart and passing it over. And for the first time, Caldwell Automotive felt like a real shop again. 6 months later, Caldwell Automotive was thriving again. The repair bays were full, the phones rang nonstop, and customers both old and new trusted the shop again. Malcolm Carter had done exactly what he had always done: put in the work, trained his team, and made sure every car that left the shop was roadworthy. But this time, something was different. This time, he wasn't just fixing cars, he was building a legacy. One evening, as Malcolm finished closing up, Ethan walked into the garage, carrying a dusty old photo frame. Malcolm glanced up. "What's that?" Ethan set the frame down on the workbench. It was a photo of James Caldwell and Malcolm, taken 20 years ago, standing beside a restored '69 Camaro one of the first major rebuilds Malcolm had led. "My dad kept this in his office," Ethan said, his voice quieter than usual. Malcolm studied the picture for a moment. "He knew what this place was really about," Ethan continued. "I didn't, not at first." He exhaled, shaking his head. "But I do now." Malcolm smirked. "Took you long enough." Ethan chuckled. "Yeah, it did." For the first time Malcolm saw it, Ethan wasn't just the boss who had fired him anymore. He was finally someone who understood what it took to run this place. With Malcolm running operations, Caldwell Automotive was better than ever. The mechanics had confidence again. Customers knew they could trust the shop. The company's reputation had been rebuilt. And Malcolm? He had finally made peace with what happened. Because he hadn't just gotten his job back. He had earned his place as the heart of Caldwell Automotive once again. And this time, even Ethan knew it. Businesses don't thrive because of numbers and quotas. They thrive because of trust, skill, and experience. Malcolm had been discarded when Ethan thought he could replace him. But in the end, Ethan learned that some people can't be replaced. And Malcolm? He walked back into Caldwell Automotive not as a worker, but as its foundation. In a world that often prioritizes speed and efficiency over craftsmanship and wisdom, Malcolm Carter's story is a testament to the irreplaceable value of experience, integrity, and trust. Too often, businesses and leaders make the mistake of believing that people, especially those who have spent decades perfecting their craft, are replaceable, interchangeable, and expendable. But time and time again, life proves that knowledge earned through years of dedication cannot simply be substituted with younger, cheaper labor or quick-fix solutions. Wisdom is not just about what you know. It's about what you've lived. This story serves as a reminder that your value does not diminish with age. The skills you've honed, the lessons you've learned, and the work ethic you've carried through life are not relics of the past. They are foundations upon which everything stands today. A business, a family, a community. These things are built on trust, and trust is built by people who do things the right way, not just the fast way. Malcolm's return to Caldwell Automotive was more than just a comeback. It was a lesson in respect and redemption. The same shop that once discarded him had to humble itself and recognize that its success was never about numbers. It was about the people who gave it meaning. This reflects a truth we see in all aspects of life. When we fail to appreciate those who came before us, we set ourselves up for failure. When we trade wisdom for convenience, we sacrifice long-term success for short-term gain. This story is also about forgiveness and purpose. Malcolm could have walked away, letting Caldwell Automotive collapse under its own arrogance, but his love for his craft, his dedication to doing things right, and his sense of responsibility brought him back, not just to fix cars, but to restore what had been lost. Sometimes life gives us